Hello, Artist Paris here. Today I want to talk about hydrating or rehydrating snuff. The people who prepare the snuff, I presume, have a certain moisture level that they think is optimum for their snuff. And of course some can be very dry and some can be very moist. I think of Smaltzers as being very moist many times, and some of the taxi snuffs, Rustica or Grunt, those tend to be much finer and drier snuffs. If you open up a lot of tins, I might have 60 different snuffs that I've opened and taken some snuff from to decant it and put it into smaller types of containers. I tend to like really tiny containers, although I think I'm a minority of maybe one there. Most people have a little bit larger containers that they're carrying, such as the smaller tins that they might carry in their pockets. And those over time, if they're not used up right away, will become at least drier than they were when you first opened them. At times, some of the very dry snuffs that might be intended to be taken dry, and that's why sometimes they call them not too easy, not for beginners and so forth, because the tendency is to get it back into the sinuses or even down the back of your throat, because it's so fine and so dry, it might make you cough and so forth. Sometimes those might actually be improved, at least for me, by making them a little bit moister, which might make the actual grain or the snuff particles become a little bit more swelled up and larger, so that they're going to have less of a tendency to go back into your sinuses or into your throat. And also it will make them maybe heavier, and by adding moisture they might stick more readily to the inside of your nostril, which is really the area that you want snuff to go to. There are various methods of hydrating that I've seen on the internet, and I'd like to talk about one or two of those methods and then show you the method that I've come upon myself. All the methods that I've heard about tend to recommend using some sort of distilled or demineralized water, such as you might buy cheaply for placing in your iron or certain other appliances. Although it says on the labels usually don't drink it, you're not going to be drinking it, and it does seem to be the best alternative, because it cuts down on the possibility of your snuff becoming contaminated by the various things in chlorine or whatever that might be in your tap water, and getting moldy over time. Some have recommended just opening your tin and pouring a couple drops into the container. It seems to me that that was mostly novices, it sounded to be, and then they just kind of stirred it around. That creates a type of mud, and I wouldn't recommend that method. Another method is to take some sort of Tupperware, place something into the bottom of it that will allow eventually your snuff to be able to sit up above the bottom of the Tupperware, and then pour your distilled water into a small layer, and then cover that for a certain length of time, probably a minimum of a half an hour, maybe a couple hours, maybe overnight, depending upon the quantity. If you use that method, you'd probably want to stir your snuff gently, so that the top layer that becomes most moist is then mixed in, and you get some drier snuff on the top, if you were going to try to humidify an entire tin or entire container of snuff. Personally, I have about 60 different snuffs that are open, and I find that I prefer to decanter to place my snuffs into other smaller containers. And in fact, my preference is the smallest of the containers. And by doing so, it allows me to have the smallest amount of snuff that's being opened and being exposed to air. The method that I use most often is to have purchased some sponges, such as these here. They come in squares and can be cut to various sizes. I tend to cut mine into small sizes because my containers are likewise small. And then what I do is I just pour some water onto these small containers, and once having done that, I kind of wring it out a little bit, or allow some of the water so it's not dripping wet. And then I just place that on top of the container. Generally, it's out of contact. There's no contact between the snuff and the sponge. I find that because I'm doing a small quantity and it's going to humidify the top layer of snuff, you could cut larger ones so that it would be able to cover a whole tin like this, that it very quickly allows the snuff to become humidified. I have opened up sometimes the tap boxes and just placed a sponge which would be the size of the snuff box in order to tap box in order to hydrate them. When speaking about snuff that is dried out, it seems to me it's best to try to prevent your snuff from drying out by keeping it well closed and maybe even some of them in a cool place rather than a heated place so that it won't dry out. I'm really not enough of a aficionado or a scientist to know how much of the aroma, taste, perfume is lost by the drying process. And does rehydrating the snuff bring back some of those smells in the same way that some people will heat snuff in their fingers to bring out the aromas? It seems to me that it does bring out flavors more. That's concerning those snuffs that have dried out. One of the snuffs that I really like is the Toque Rustica, which they tell you is a very strong nicotine snuff, but also is very, very fine. For that snuff, I found when I first purchased it, it was almost too dry for me to be able to really comfortably snuff it on the road. Whereas once I hydrated it, it allowed the snuff to be less of small particles that ended up going down the back of my throat or into the sinuses and made for a pleasant experience. So now I'm interested in what your methods might be for rehydrating your snuff when it's become dried out. So that's all from here, from Paris, France.